Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Melissa, physician, author, and executive strategist. Dr. Melissa is a widely recognized voice on covert narcissism and high-functioning individuals. She works closely with executives and leaders, helping them identify the less obvious relational patterns that keep them stuck in dynamics that are difficult to recognize and even harder to understand. As you'll hear, Dr. Melissa and I occasionally approach these questions from different perspectives, which I think makes for a rich conversation. Her work focuses heavily on narcissistic tactics, nervous system adaptations, flying monkeys, you'll hear that concept come up at least a few times, trauma responses, and the behavioral patterns that keep people trapped in these relationships. My own orientation, as many of you know, is more psychodynamic. I'm often interested in different questions. What does this person represent psychologically? In other words, if you find yourself with somebody who has these covert narcissistic traits, that's a question that I may ask. What does this person represent to you psychologically? In terms of the relationship, what fantasy is organizing the attachment? If you're in this kind of relationship, what is the person hoping to repair or finally receive in this relationship? And what might have gone missing earlier in life that makes this relationship so emotionally compelling? It was actually Dr. Melissa's work and her writing on high-functioning individuals and why they often find themselves entangled in narcissistic relationships that led me to invite her onto the podcast. For those of you who have ever been involved with someone who has covert narcissistic characteristics, you know how disorienting these relationships can be. They often begin with a powerful sense of being seen, understood, and deeply recognized, only to become increasingly confusing, one-sided, and then difficult to get out of. In this first part of my conversation with Dr. Melissa, we explore some of the core dynamics that make covert narcissism so difficult to recognize. Perhaps most importantly, we begin to examine why the relationship with a covert narcissistic partner can become so emotionally compelling. We talk about how it's not simply because of who the other person is. It's not literally about the other person, but because of what that person comes to represent psychologically, and the hope that through this relationship, you might finally receive something that's long been missing. In this conversation, we cover a lot more. I'm really excited to share this with you, so let's get right into it. Hello, Dr. Melissa. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm really glad that you're here to join us today, so thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for inviting me. This is wonderful.
Yeah, of course, I'm really excited about this topic. Before we get into the topic of the day is how high-functioning, growth-oriented individuals, how they end up feeling sort of trapped in narcissistic dynamics. But before we get into all that, I just want to start in a very general way, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Because, narcissism is a complicated concept, and people have different definitions of it. So maybe that's a safe place to start is, can you just tell me, from your perspective, when you think about narcissism, how do you define that? And what makes covert narcissism so difficult or so much harder to spot?
That's a great question. We know that narcissism as a personality disorder is its own thing with lack of identity, lack of their own identity, needing to source that from other people, needing narcissistic supply to regulate their emotions, their self-esteem, combined interpersonal exploitative dynamics. And I tend to think there's the strict diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. There's also a lot of narcissistic tactics. And so I focus on the tactics and what they do to the individual rather than focusing on the narcissist themselves, because I'm not aware of any way to help them specifically. But that's really where I come at it from, is that the narcissist has distorted or lack of identity, their own identity. They have deep-seated internal shame that is driving a lot of very toxic interpersonal behaviors.
Okay. If we start narrowing it down a little bit, because I think this is closer to at least what I read about from in your writing is the covert narcissist. Maybe you could just get us oriented a little bit in terms of how you see the covert narcissism present itself.
Absolutely. So I think, the word narcissist is very overused, perhaps, and underused in other ways in society. And most people think of the narcissist as the person who's very flashy, showy, spending a lot of money, driving the fancy car, has a different woman on each arm kind of thing. And the covert narcissist is so subtle that they go completely unrecognized. I find that most of my clients they've seen the overt one. They know to avoid that. Yeah. But the covert one gets completely under their radar because they come off often as a victim, or they're the hero. They're rescuing, they're caretaking. They're the one who knows you better than anyone else. They're self-deprecating often, or they're extremely generous and charitable. So it would appear. It's all the persona. But they just come off as the exact opposite of the father or the mother or the whoever you're trying to find someone, that is different than.
Yeah. They have one trait. I'm curious what you think about this, because I know there's so much we could say about covert narcissism. I've done full episodes on this. But one trait I imagine was of interest when we're thinking about the people that we're going to talk about who get entangled in these dynamics is that they also present as emotionally involved people. In other words, they have a good sense of what's right. Like they tend to know, I don't just mean morally, but they always have the right answer, or they know what the best thing to do is. And I'm not sure how, if you think about them in that way as well. I mean, that's part of the grandiosity, of course, but they do it, to your point a moment ago, not in a way that they're bragging. They're not overtly bragging about how intelligent or evolved they are or how morally correct they are, but they have a very subtle way of doing this.
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm in the midst of finishing a book on covert narcissist tactics. I've added a few more, so it's up to 29 now. But the overt tactics seem so obvious because it seems like they are only interested in themselves. It's clear that they're manipulating you for their own gain. It's clear that they're lying for their own gain or whatever tactic they're using. But with the covert, they're disguised as love or concern or care, even in their conversations with the target themselves, or in the ways that they triangulate and they create their flying monkeys that then wreak havoc on the target later. They can do that without ever saying anything negative. It's like a distorted kind of smear campaign where they say something that sounds nice and loving and caring, but can completely flip the tables. And the target is sitting there wondering, what in the heck is even going on here? It's completely disorienting because it's so subtle. Their friends and family aren't going to say, oh, he or she was saying this behind your back, because what they were saying sounded nice.
Sounded nice, yeah. So let's get into this because it's so subtle that you may not pick up on it. And that leads into something I wanted to talk to you about also, which is you work with what you call high-achieving individuals, right? And they often get blindsided in these relationships. And to your point, right, that things happen in such a covert, I put that in air quotes, right, subtle way because they're not overtly insulting. But I guess maybe, again, we could do this before we get into the dynamic and what happens interpersonally in these relationships. What's meant when you say like high achievers, and what is it you're actually talking about, and how do they get blindsided? But maybe we could just start with the high achievers. How do you define that?
I see high achieving as more of an internal characteristics, or the internal characteristics or attributes that someone has. Certainly a lot of my clients are doctors or lawyers or business owners, people that would externally be seen as high achieving, but they might also be a stay-at-home mom who happened to be a high school valedictorian. Okay. They might be an elementary school teacher who is like doing the best of the best as far as what they're doing. So when I talk about high achieving, it's not specifically based on the number of degrees or the income level, but the attributes or characteristics they have is they're very growth oriented. They're problem solvers. They have the tendency to turn the lens inward. When they're having a conflict, they look at what their role is first, realizing that two people have a role in any kind of dynamic. They're incredibly accountable. they have a high capacity. They're the person who's the busiest in the room, but still gets handed the new task, either at work or in the family or in a volunteer situation or wherever it is.
Dr. Melissa, do they take it on then? Is that something? Because that's part of their personality.
It's not necessarily part of their inherent personality. It's the way narcissistic and the abuse in the past has weaponized them to take on these different aspects of what now have become their personality, which is super fascinating to me. It's like the book that I'm writing goes into how each tactic deposits something in their nervous system or in their way of being. Lying sets up the foundation for things not being true, this sort of baseline. And then here comes denial, where their whole belief in evidence-based process kind of falls apart because you present the narcissist with the evidence and they deny it. You're like, the evidence is right here. And they're like, yeah, that never happened. Right. And then the high capacity, high achieving person goes through this process of, this is costing me a lot of mental bandwidth. This is a lot of metabolic currency is being spent arguing with someone who is denying the truth actively. So it's easier just to let it go. It's easier just to sort of set that aside. And then that denial sets up gaslighting and so on with some of these tactics that alter perception that happen first. So in terms of the high capacity person, it's a fawn response. And I always think most people think of fawn as please and appease. It's I want everyone to like me. I don't want anyone to be mad at me. And the high achievers really reject that because they're like, that's not me at all.
Even though they take on that additional work.
Yeah, because it's not about pleasing the other person. They don't care about being liked or necessarily being respected. They're not worried that the person's going to be mad at them if they don't take on the extra work. That's not why they do it. They do it because they have the capacity to do it. And the argument or conflict or continuing discussions about it or whatever that will ensue if they say no take up more of their metabolic currency, their bandwidth, their mental processing power than to just do it. It's like, this is only going to take me an hour to do it. It's going to take me 6 hours to argue about it. I'm just going to do it. Even though it's not their responsibility, it's not their job.
That's interesting because they seem like reflectful people, based on what I've read that you've written. They seem reflective. It's a little surprising, that they would just say, oh, this is going to be too time consuming to argue or fight this one out. So I'll just take it on, because I can imagine if they just keep taking things on, that's going to lead to resentment at some point.
It does. And I think that it's so subtle. It's not necessarily like they're consciously choosing, this is 1 hour versus 6 hours of arguing about it, so I'm going to choose it. Because they tend to be the people who are very good at setting boundaries and drawing lines and those kind of things as well. But what tends to happen is in that the fawn response is really happening outside of their conscious cognitive processing, as a trauma response. It's happening more below the radar, and their body, their nervous system is just doing this calculation, like this is just easier to do this myself than to argue about this or to just have to have ongoing meetings or, whatever about it. It's very subtle, I think, and I see it all the time. I just see examples of it one after the next, and I think that they would really reject the idea of fawn as far as it's not people pleasing. They don't care about pleasing the other person, or they care little about pleasing the other person. It's more like it's easier to just do it.
So how do they then end up sort of entangled? In other words, people end up with partners for a reason. It doesn't just happen, coincidentally. Something not compels us, but drives us or interests us, right? To gravitate towards a specific type of person, right? So what ends up being appealing to them in terms of getting hooked up, matched up with the covert narcissist?
It's a two-way street. So they're extremely attractive to the covert narcissist because the covert narcissist wants someone who increases their status, especially since they often are more self-deprecating or underperforming. They want someone who increases their status. But then they get even more narcissistic supply from devaluing someone who they saw at one time as better than them. Now, for the high achiever who's getting mixed up in this, especially if they had an overt narcissist parent, grandparent, someone of influence in their past.
Mm-hmm.
The covert narcissist seems so emotionally aware. They seem so doting and attentive, and they're a good listener. You know, they remember some passing comment you made 3 months ago about where your family used to vacation in the summer, and they bring it up and you're like, oh my gosh, this person, there's finally someone in this world who sees and hears me.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
It's all part of the covert narcissist's style, but they feel really seen and heard.
Because, wait, I just want to highlight this. It's really important. So there may have been more of an overt or some type of narcissism in their early familiar, like in the early family, right? So there's something familiar about this. But growing up, if there was this kind of whatever type cluster of narcissism, let's just stay with overt, which you mentioned, it implies no matter what that something went missing in their early childhood, right? And what you're describing then is this contemporary person, they feel or they really believe that finally, right, that now this is an opportunity that I could be seen, heard, or recognized, and that some of that actually does happen, at least initially at this point in the relationship.
Absolutely. And if they did have a previous toxic relationship, which could be a very impactful one, like a parent, it could have been a sixth grade best friend. If they've experienced these tactics and they developed a trauma bond, I always think of the trauma bond as not necessarily specific to a person. It's what's been instilled or installed into your own nervous system. So here they've adapted these false core beliefs, false because they're not true, core because they're about their identity, that they're not good enough, or they're too much, or that they're invisible, or that they're not worthy, or that they're alone, or that they don't have a place to belong, whatever they might be. And then the covert narcissist is going to come along in such a subtle way. You know, the person who has an I'm invisible identity, they're going to be the one who mentions the random comment you made 3 months ago that was like, just this passing nothing. And you're like, oh my gosh, this person sees me and hears me. I'm not invisible. But then when they want to devalue you, it's going to be the silent treatment. It's going to be acting like you don't exist. They're going to devalue off of the same false core belief that they love bombed on.
And what happens that they suddenly devalue you? Like, why does that shift?
Well, I think of devaluing as starting from the first moment that they meet. Most people don't recognize it. Like, I've had a lot of people tell me, well, I want to enjoy the love bombing phase. I want to like really ride that out and enjoy it. And then I'll get out before they devalue me. That does not work that way because they're devaluing. I've heard that a lot. And they're devaluing from the moment you meet, because when they're presenting a persona, they're not presenting who they actually are. They're playing a role. When they're presenting that as their persona, and if their persona is that they're a good listener, or they're, a great son or daughter to their elderly parent, or they're generous, or they're church going, or whatever it is, they're taking away your ability to choose and discern whether or not you want to be in this relationship, because you don't know who you are actually getting into a relationship with, regardless of whether it's a romantic relationship, friendship, business partnership. And so that's devaluing in the first place, because they're pulling the wool over your eyes about who they are.
So Dr. Wait, let me ask you about that. So in that example you just gave, which I really appreciate, so someone may say to you, I'm just going to ride this out. Like, this is the, I don't know, whatever concept you like to subscribe to, but let's say it's the love bombing phase, right? But there's an excessive amount of idealization, attentiveness, they feel recognized. And they say to you, Dr. Melissa, I'm just going to ride this out. It feels too good, right? In the work with that type of person, what is it you start to do at that moment? Like, do you show them exactly what you're describing to me right now? That you are actually being devalued, that even though it feels so compelling that you're being devalued, is that something you may bring into your work with them?
Absolutely. And I would also talk about their brain has been attenuated to want the dopamine hit of feeling that seen and heard, or feeling, the intermittent reinforcement that they're getting, the love bombing, the idealization that's tripping those brain chemicals is extremely addictive. And it is very common to be so addicted to love bombing and toxic relationships that you realize those are the people that you're attracted to. And so I think there's a whole process to unhook that, because otherwise I've had people say, well, then I just have to settle for a boring relationship.
Yes.
Like I want the super hot chemistry.
Yeah, of course, especially, well, to your point a moment ago, especially if they grew up with some type of narcissistic parenting, because something has been already missing in their life. So this is going to be so appealing to them that even if you describe it, they're going to be like, yeah, what are you, out of your mind? Like, who would ever go back to a boring relationship when I can have this?
Right. And what they don't realize is that their brain was hijacked. The brain chemistry was hijacked. That can be undone, but that they're operating from this hijacked place where they're not seeing what's actually going on. And it is absolutely certain that it will progress into a means of devaluation that they really do not find desirable.
Now, is it certain in your mind or is it certain in their mind? In other words, is that something they can even hear you say?
Sometimes, and I tend to work with people who've already left the relationship and they've been out for a period of time, they've done the therapy, and they're like, why am I a narcissist magnet? Why do I keep attracting new ones? Or why am I still ruminating? Why am I hung up on these same problems? Why am I under earning and over delivering and feel like I'm performing and all of those kinds of things? So that tends to be where I hit them in the relationship life cycle. But there are some of those who say like, well, that love bombing phase is so fun. I just want to enjoy that. And then I'll just get out before it gets bad.
Okay.
But that doesn't happen.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just play around with this for a moment, because I think it's always so valuable to compare it to more of a psychodynamic perspective. You know, I'm a psychoanalyst by profession, so I'll take a more psychodynamic twist on this. If I was sitting there, I'm imagining as I'm listening, I'm sitting there with this person, and they say, oh yeah, this is so much fun, it's so exciting, he really appreciates me, he remembers little things that I say from months ago. What I would like to do with that type of person is I would want to get closer to their, what we call an unconscious fantasy. In other words, what is it you're imagining? Yes, I get it. It's fun, and I can totally appreciate, and I would even validate that because I'll be listening to stories and hear how exciting it is, right? There's a fantasy that goes along with that, and I like to get closer to that. Like, what is the fantasy? What are they picturing? What do they imagine is going to happen? Or what is it that they're actually getting? And I don't know, Dr. Melissa, if you get into this, I'm sure you do actually. It must be part of the treatment, is what went missing earlier in childhood, growing up. I don't know if you make those kind of links back to childhood. And by the way, I don't always do that myself because sometimes it's just too far away. It's not accessible because they're so focused on the relationship, you know, because that's what's most immediate. But I wonder if that's something you bring in as well. Would you try to make that link with them and show them why this is so exciting and that they can't give it up because it's filling something in them that went missing?
To an extent, yes. I mean, I'm not a therapist, so I'm not doing therapy and I don't come at it from the therapist lens. I work with people after they've done therapy. So I'm not coming from the psychoanalysis piece, but what I often show them is most people will come to me because they've either had a romantic relationship or a business partnership that's gone really bad. Yeah. And they think that is the first toxic relationship that they've ever been in and that this blindsided them and came out of nowhere. And as I get to know them, I've yet to meet one who did not have a parent who was using narcissistic tactics. There may be some in the world, but I've not yet come across one. Or they have a past that is littered with toxic relationships. And to be able to say, okay, this didn't just start a year ago or 15 years ago or whatever with this one person. This goes way back to the beginning. And this is where this belief was installed that it's your job to fix the problem. You know, this belief that you're the problem. And here they've got this slew of flying monkeys that are all going to agree you're the problem. And you take that on and you're like, I got to fix my defects and whatnot, to see like where that began, where that training ground was. So in terms of the going back, not from a therapy end, but to really see, I find with the people that I work with, it's very helpful to understand why. Because when you understand why and you can reverse engineer how this happened, how was this belief installed? How was this doubt created? How did I develop this high capacity fawn response? How was my growth mindset weaponized? How was my accountability weaponized? All of those kind of things. Then all of a sudden you're empowered to ensure that it doesn't happen again. So I love to look back for that purpose, but I'm not therapeutically going back.
Yeah, look, I mean, again, just listening to what you were saying, you don't even have to go back, because if you're able to show them to your point, that you're being devalued at the same time. Remember you said it begins from the very beginning, and it begins in such a subtle way because they're not really taking you into consideration, right? And if they can even get a grain of reality, like if they could see this at all, you don't need to go back, because then the question becomes not just what's wrong with me, but also what's wrong with this person that I'm with? And then just back to my concept of the fantasy, the unconscious fantasy is going to be what? Are things going to change? Are you going to fix this person? Is there going, like, if they do recognize the devaluing, again, something you pointed out, is that going to stop in the future? Like, what is it that they're imagining? Are they going to change this person so that the person becomes, if they're with a covert narcissist, there has to be some feeling that, and I think this is what you were getting at with the devaluing. I'm really just leaning into that because I can appreciate it. Because when you're with somebody like this, typically you know that there's one person in the room. Whether you could see that or not or come to recognize it, that's a completely different story. And, I see this quite a bit, working with young women who start to recognize it's a really painful process that their mother or their parent may be a narcissist. It's like so devastating that they haven't seen it their whole life. But suddenly they realize they're not actually paying any attention to me. Like they don't actually hear me at all. When I ask them about something, it's not about me. It suddenly becomes about them somehow. So,
exactly.
Yeah. And then the question is, I know I'm leaning on this word, but what's the fantasy? Is that going to now change in this new relationship with this new partner? Yeah,
I think that there's some of that, but I think the other piece that is really important is that belief that they are the problem is so deeply installed. It's like they say something mean, you get upset, you're too sensitive, or you need to toughen up, or you're too insecure,
yes,
or, you're too controlling. Or whatever, all of the projection, all of the blame shifting, all of the setup that goes into sort of laying the groundwork or the foundation for this type of abuse has all occurred. And now here you have someone who is intelligent, resourced, willing to look inside and see what their part in the dynamic is. And they're like, I don't think it's necessarily that they see it clearly as this is a toxic person and I'm going to try to fix them. I think it's more like, if only I explained it a different way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If only I tried this communication strategy, or if only I made them see how this really makes me feel, then I know they love me. They wouldn't do this anymore. Or if only I reduced their trauma so they felt like they could be honest because they had to lie in childhood.
Yeah, but that's it, Dr.
Right?
Moser. That's it right there. You said, I don't think it's about them trying to fix them, but that's it. You just said it. If only I could, it's all generated towards fixing them.
They
that
think
comes
they're
back,
trying to fix themselves.
but it's both. It's not one or the other. That's how
Right.
come these things are complicated, because if they could fix them, they could fix themselves at the same time. Because what's going to happen if they fix them, that other person would become what? More attuned, more loving, more compassionate, less judgmental. I don't know, whatever they're trying to fix, right?
Yeah, well, and I think they want them to be the persona that love bombed them in the first place, that they either fell in love with or they were attracted to as the visionary business partner or employee that they hired to be their star salesperson, or you know,
of course,
whatever the situation is. They want the persona to be real because there's a sunk cost bias there as well. They've invested time, money, resources, energy in this relationship, regardless of relationship type. And they don't want to write that off as a loss.
Yes.
There's
Well, that's it.
an
Listen,
element of
no,
really
you're saying it. Listen, you're saying it so nicely. Let me just recap it for the listeners, okay? Because we're covering quite a bit here. So persona, I'm just sharing the way that I heard it. And again, thinking about it more from a psychodynamic framework, is that it's not so much about the person, but about what the person represents in their mind and the role that that person will play for them. So it's fixing the person, but like we just said, it's fixing themselves as well. But at the part that I'm emphasizing here, and sometimes I get into this a little bit, with my own patients, that they try to insist it is about the person. There is some truth, of course. There's always a reality here. But to your word, Dr. Melissa, it's also about the persona, like the representation of the person, who they want the person to be. and why they need them to be that way. And can that person ever really be that way? You said they want to go back to that magical, blissful state of the relationship. Of course, who wouldn't? But that's not reality, unfortunately. Those kinds of things don't last very long before something interferes with them. And the higher they go up, the more magical and wonderful it is, the lower the crash is going to be when they come down, the inevitable crash, because relationships just can't maintain that sort of high.
No, that's definitely true. And I think that the persona that is crafted by the covert narcissist, as far as this is who they present themselves to be, and they've presented themselves to be this since maybe childhood or the teenage years. And so all of their high school friends see them this way. All of their family, extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins see them this way. All of their past coworkers see them this way. So when you come in and now there are dozens or hundreds or thousands of people who see this is who this person is, it becomes so easy to say, well, this is who they are. They're attentive, they're compassionate, they're generous, they're, this person. And the fact that they snarked at me or put me down or whatever, he must be under a lot of stress. Or she must have had a really bad day. It's easy to make excuses for that because they believe that that persona is real. And then the surrounding people are reinforcing that, like, oh, you've got to give him a break or give her a break. She's under a lot of stress right now. And you kind of discount what you're seeing with your own eyes to be true because it doesn't fit. And then when you look at the intermittent reinforcement with the trauma bond, they can complain about how you made dinner or how much money you spent or whatever 9 days in a row. But on the 10th day, compliment it. And you're like, oh, that's where she is, or that's the guy I fell in love with, or that's the person I chose to form this business collaboration with. That's the real person. You've got 9 days of history that's terrible. The 10th day, you get that little bit of reinforcement, and you're like, oh, that's where they are. I just need to fix what I'm doing, so I bring out more of that.
Yeah. And that brings us back. This is a nice place, actually. I want to do a little review, and then we'll set the stage for the direction in which we're going to go for just the remainder of our discussion. So that brings us back to what, again, I referred to earlier as the fantasy. You see, there's the fantasy again, or what you called the hope. You called it the hope. I call the hope the fantasy, by the way, because it's quite removed. Well, depending on the level of what's going on in this relationship, it could be more or less removed from reality. But it's an unconscious fantasy or the hope that finally we're going to get back, or that things can change. And I will get that magical feeling again of oneness, that we're together. And these are words that I actually hear, Dr. Melissa, that things are great. And when I hear that stuff from a patient, I say, well, hold on, slow down a second, right? Because I know that we're entering into a whole different realm of reality when people come in and they're like, it was an amazing weekend, the best weekend ever. Things are great. We're entering into that magical world. But anyway, I'm just sort of pulling things together because what I want to talk to you next, if you think this is a good direction for us to go, is when that kind of dynamic becomes so compelling, how do we help somebody begin to loosen the grip? In other words, would lead to healing. I want to get your perspective on that because you said you get them after they're out of the relationship. They're literally out of the relationship, but it doesn't sound like emotionally they're out of the relationship. So if you think that's a good direction for us to go, I want to sort of get your thoughts on how do we begin to create some space and what actually does lead to them being out of the relationship. And sometimes it could be literal and sometimes it could be emotional. Not everybody has to leave. And some people who leave never really leave. But anyway, how does that sound to you? Is that a good direction for us to go?
That sounds great, yes.